In the coming videos in this playlist, I'm going to talk about specific ego dramas. But first I want to talk about a topic of why we cling to our dramas. Because it's important to understand that. You have to realize that this particular playlist on ego dramas, this is not for beginners on the spiritual path. That's why I first talked about ego illusions and ego games. So you have to have a certain foundation on the spiritual path before you can really start seeing the dramas. And the importance of that is that as you grow on the spiritual path, as you get a little bit more used to thinking in terms of ego and what the ego is, you develop the willingness to look at yourself. And you really are going to need that ability to see the ego dramas, because there's a tremendous opposition from the ego, or rather from the subconscious selves, to, first of all, seeing the drama. I know for myself, when I first started hearing about this concept of ego dramas, at first I was very willing to see how other people had outplayed these ego dramas. But I was reluctant to see my own ego dramas. And it took me a while to really see through it, because these selves, they will try to pull your conscious mind, the conscious you, away from actually stepping outside the self so you can see the drama. You see, when you're inside a self that's based on a particular ego drama, you can't see the drama. You can't see there's anything wrong with it. You think this is just the way it is. This is the way it's supposed to be. I mean, this is reality, you think. And you can't see the unreality, you can't see the illusion behind it. So that's why it's important to understand why we cling to our dramas. And when I first started hearing about the concept of ego, the teachings I had at the time, and which really is similar to a lot of the teachings you'll find out there in psychology about ego, or even in self-help spiritual movements. And the teaching I had at that time really just talked about, here's the ego, here's certain characteristics, here's how you can overcome it. But they didn't really talk about where did the ego come from. And it wasn't really until I got those specific teachings from the Ascended Masters, including the 3 books I have based this talks about egos on, including this one, Freedom from Ego Dramas, that I started realizing where the ego actually came from. You see, if you look at fundamentalist Christians, or even many Christians, they will say that we are born into sin. We are born as sinners. And when I first started hearing about ego, I had this impression too. I was just born with an ego. I just always had an ego. And this was in a sense ironic, because I always believed in reincarnation. So yes, you can say you are born with an ego in this lifetime, but if you start going back, were you always born? Were you created with an ego? And without going too much into subtleties here, let's just say that the ego we are talking about, when we are talking about ego dramas, you were not born, you were not created with that ego. You didn't come into being with the drama queen ego. So where did it come from? Well, you could say you created it, but that isn't entirely accurate either. Because the drama ego is, as I've explained in some of the other videos, it's really not at the personal level. The drama is at this dimension, this epic dimension. There's something that reaches beyond you. So what we can say is that you did, when you first descended to Earth, you descended without this kind of a dualistic ego. And you created your personal ego. You created that by making choices. We'll talk about those choices in a little bit, but you created it by making choices. But the ego that is, the drama ego, is really something that is in the collective consciousness. And this was not created by you personally. This was created by the fallen beings. If you're new to the concept of fallen beings, I have talked about it in previous talks about ego, but if you're new to it, watch my video, How the World Was Created. It tells you what they are and what they do. So they were the ones who created this drama queen ego. And so you have taken that on. But why did you take it on? Because it gave your personal ego something that that ego wants. In other words, when I first heard about ego, it seemed like this is an alien bad thing in your psychology, in your subconscious mind, that's making you selfish and causing you to do all these things that cause suffering. So as a spiritual person, you need to get rid of it. And that again made it seem like, oh, well, I didn't really create the ego. It was just something that's there, right? And now I just need to get rid of it. But you can't really get rid of it until you understand where it came from. And it came because you made choices to create the ego. And why did you make those choices? Because the ego gave you an advantage. And the same thing with the dramas, the ego dramas. They are giving people an advantage. And until you see the advantage that a particular drama is giving you, you can't step outside of it and you can't let go of it. You can't let that self die. Because well, let's talk about it in a slightly different context. You have a concept called Catch-22. It's actually based on a novel that's written by a man called Joseph Keller, an American. And he describes in there how he was part of the people who flew bombing planes in the Mediterranean, American planes that were sent to bomb in different parts of Europe. And they had a very, very high fatality rate. Many planes didn't return, and many people were killed even in the planes by machine gun fire and shrapnel and so forth. And so they had this policy that you could be exempt from flying these missions if you were deemed to be mentally incapable. And so he tried to get out of flying these missions by going to the doctor and saying, I'm psychologically unfit, I had these panic attacks, I just can't fly, I need to be exempt. But the doctor said that if you were sane enough to see that you were insane, you couldn't be exempt. You were not insane enough to be exempt. So this is what he called a catch-22. And this is what the fallen beings try to put us in with the ego dramas. Because it's easier to see the personal dramas, but it's harder to see the ego dramas. It's like the ego dramas add another structure on top of the personal ego. And if we don't see that this is an illusion, we are caught. We can't start looking at the personal ego because we have this drama ego that's hiding it for us. So, and what it does is the ego drama makes it seem like there's an epic cause we have to fight for. I've talked about this before. You can define all these epic causes. Communism must win. Capitalism must defeat communism. The Jews must be killed. Our nation must be superior, show its superiority. All of these dramas out there, even our religion must be the only one, or even spiritual teachings. Our spiritual teaching must replace all others, and this kind of thing. So this is an impersonal cause you are working towards. And this makes you focus your attention out there. You're basically saying, I can't be at peace until this outer drama is fulfilled. So we have this outer problem that has to be solved. And what you are really saying is, until this outer problem has been fulfilled, I can't look at my personal ego. And that means your personal ego can lean back in the chair, smoke a cigar, because it knows you're not going to be looking at it, because you're always focused out there. So this is what I mean with a catch-22. And it's a catch-22 because, in a way, you can't see through the epic drama until you see that it gives an advantage to your personal ego. But you can't, of course, look at your personal ego as long as you're focusing your attention out there. So the way to cut the Gordian knot and break the catch-22 is to really start looking at what is the advantage that my personal ego gains from these ego dramas. And then you can start unraveling it. So, what is the advantage? Well, different people have different advantages that they get from these epic ego dramas. And one of them can simply be a sense of purpose in life. I am engaged in this epic quest to prove the superiority of my nation by getting more medals at the Olympics. So I'm dedicating my entire life to training my body so I can swim the 100 meters faster than anybody else. And you're totally focusing your entire attention on this, not having time to look at your personal ego or your psychology or anything like that. You're just focused on this outer task. So it gives you a tremendous sense of purpose. What many of these athletes experience is once they've won the gold medal at the Olympics and they're no longer top athletes, their lives are empty. So it's a temporary thing. But nevertheless, you know, there are other dramas. You see some people, for example, who have been dedicating themselves to being Christian missionaries. And they can live an entire lifetime trying to convert other people, going on missions to Africa, for example, and converting other people to Christianity and this kind of thing. There are those for whom the epic drama is to make more money than anybody else, become a billionaire. So you see that there are dramas that can tie up people's attention for an entire lifetime. I don't have a look at myself because I have to fulfill this quest. Now, it can be even legitimate goals as improving your country, improving your government, inventing something. I mean, there's many of these goals. Educating yourself, making scientific discoveries, can be all these things. And take care here. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with all of these activities. I mean, some of them obviously very self-centered, but inventing something, there's nothing wrong with that. But you can approach it with an epic mindset, which gives you an excuse. The advantage that the personal ego gets out of this is you never need to look at yourself because you're always focused on this outer task. And the only way to really overcome this is to see that the outer task doesn't have to be fulfilled. In other words, the ego drama defines a goal, some kind of problem that must be solved. And until the problem is solved, you can't look at yourself. And the only way to break that is to really see that the goal isn't as important as you thought it was. Maybe it's not even real. I mean, what does it really mean that your nation wins more Olympic medals than the other nation? Is that a real problem that needs to be solved here? So, so this is one thing, a sense of purpose. Related to that could be you're not bored. I mean, some people really are at a level where they have been in embodiment for so long on Earth, they have tried so many different things, that they have almost an existential boredom with life on Earth. And so by engaging in this epic drama, they get a sense that, oh yeah, here's something that needs to be done, and so they're not bored while they're focusing on this. But now we get to the real underlying reason that is especially relevant for spiritual people. I realize that the vast majority of people on Earth wouldn't be able to relate to this, but for spiritual people it's important to understand this. What is it that the epic dramas give to your personal ego? Now, I've said before that we have the two basic states of consciousness. We can see ourselves as connected beings and as separate beings. And when we go into separation, that's when we create the dualistic ego. because we have to justify why we went into separation, and we create the ego to define that justification, but also to uphold it, to defend it. And because we are using the duality consciousness, as I've explained several times, there are always two opposite polarities. So you're taking one relative argument, you're elevating that this is the absolute truth, and that's why it's justified that I went into separation. But there will always be another relative truth that can oppose yours. So you're always threatened. So this means that the ego is on this constant quest to create in you a sense of equilibrium, a sense that you are okay, you have a firm ground to stand on. And I remember when I was a child, I was in school, we would play in the schoolyard. And so we would have a narrow zone along one side of the schoolyard that was a free zone, and one on the other side. And then there was a team in the middle that was supposed to catch some of us. And we were running from one side to the other. So you were running, you were trying to avoid being tagged and get to the other side. And so while you were running, all you were looking at, where are the others? How do I get there? How do I avoid tripping over something? And you were just focused on running. But when you got to the free zone, you could relax and you could look around and see where are the other students. And so this is what the ego is always seeking, to get to that free zone where it's safe. But this is, of course, an impossible quest. But the dramas can give you that sense, because some dramas define that you, just by your birth, you belong to a special group of people. It can be, looking back to biblical times, the Jews. They were God's chosen people. The superior God of the universe had chosen this little tribe in the Middle East as his chosen people. So this gives your ego, the personal ego, that sense of it's safe because I belong to this group of people. And so you see how this adds that epic cause on top of it. And then, of course, you have had many other people who've had that. Many Christians, they belong to the superior religion. Many Muslims, they belong to the superior religion. Some Hindus, some Buddhists, they feel the same way. So it can give you that sense that you are safe because you are special. Now, what's really important to understand here is that when you are a spiritual person, you can fairly quickly come to see through these outer dramas that I'm talking about. And many spiritual people have probably already seen through them in past lives. That's why we are openly spiritual in this lifetime, why we found the spiritual path and the spiritual teaching, because you came to see through these dramas and give them up. But if we step further back, we have to ask ourselves, is there a deeper level of advantage that these epic dramas give to your personal ego? You have Jesus' parable about the man who built his house on sand, and it was blown over by the storm. And then there was a man who built his house on rocky ground, and it could withstand the storm. So, as I said, the ego is on this quest for safety and security, but it can only try to build it based on this world. And this is, of course, the impossible quest. The ego is building its house on sand, and it will be blown over by the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. But building your house on rocky ground is making the shift where you are not seeking to build your sense of security on the things of this world, but on the one mind, the Christ mind. You are looking for something beyond. And that means, as I said, you shift from seeing yourself as a separate being to seeing yourself as a connected being. But making that shift of seeing yourself as a connected being doesn't mean you are ego-free. That's the important point. There are some people who think, oh, I have awakened, I had this awakened experience, now I'm ego-free. This was ego death I experienced, but it isn't. It's just one aspect of ego perhaps that died, but certainly not all of it. And so that's why it's a process of shifting, where instead of seeking your security from the things of this world, you're seeking it within by connecting to your I Am Presence and your ascended masters. And this takes time, and it's a gradual path. That's why I talked about this path where when you see yourself as a connected being, you are at a certain level of consciousness. I have some breakthrough videos that talk about the 144 levels. And the connection is at the 48th level, and we can rise on the spiritual path towards the 144th level, which is the highest level where we can ascend. But there's an important turning point at the 96th level where, in order to get from the 48th to the 96th, you're actually building a spiritual sense of self. In a sense, you could say you're building a spiritualized ego that takes you beyond the collective consciousness. There is a downward pull of the collective consciousness, and this takes you beyond it. But at the 96th level, in order to get higher, you have to see that even this ego, you have to let go of. You have to let it die gradually in order to go higher. And this can be a difficult transition because as you are rising from the 48th to the 96th level, this spiritualized ego gives you a sense of security and equilibrium. And this is better than having your equilibrium built on worldly things that are outside yourself. But it's still not fully based on the Christ consciousness. So, in order to really grasp this, we have to come to a realization that, boy, it took me a long time to get there, and I have found very few spiritual teachings that talk about this. But if you look at yourself, if you think about yourself, what is important to you? What is your life really? Is your life your physical body? What happens to the physical body? What you're doing with the physical body? Is your life the outer situation? Is your sense of equilibrium, sense of who you are, is it based on your sex, your nationality, your race, how much money you have in the bank, what your accomplishments are, how many Olympic medals you have in the cabinet, all of these things. Is it based on that? Well, if it was, you wouldn't be a spiritual person, right? So you already realize you are not these outer things. But there's a switch you can make. And again, it took me a while to make it, so I'm not saying you can just, make it like that, but you can certainly make it where you realize that what you really are is an experiencer. And what really matters in your life is your experience of life, your life experience. In other words, the important aspect of your life is not what's happening outside of you, it's what's happening inside of you. And why is that? Because the whole purpose of life is our growth in consciousness. And what helps you grow in consciousness? It's that you come to build your sense of who you are on the rock of Christ, on the one mind, on your I Am Presence, and not on the shifting sands of this world. And this is, of course, what the ego is trying to prevent you from doing, because the ego knows it will die as you become more and more united with your higher self. There will come a point. You see what I'm trying to say here? At a certain level of consciousness, your sense of security and equilibrium is based on the ego, which is basing its sense of security on the outer things. But as you rise higher, you gradually shift. And there comes a point where you can consciously shift and realize that your sense of security is no longer based on the shifting sands of the outer world. It's based on the inner rock of Christ. And when you make that point, that shift consciously, your ego is going to lose its power over you. And in a sense, the dualistic ego can die completely. So, What's it going to take to make that switch? Well, it's going to take that you realize why you created the personal ego in the first place and what advantage it gave you. And in order to realize this, we can look at again, what is the purpose of the world? It is your growth in consciousness. And how do you grow in consciousness? You go by having an experience until you don't want it anymore. You've had enough of that experience. You want something more than that experience. So I've said before that you have this very old view that something is wrong, that the world is wrong. There's nothing wrong with the world. In the East, you have this concept, only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion. Therefore, you need to forsake the world, go away from the world. You have the same in Christianity, forsake all worldly goods in order to go within. But in reality, this world is just an experience machine. It's a reality simulator I've compared it to. And the purpose is that you can experiment with whatever is possible on Earth. You can have any experience you want to have on Earth, and you have it over many lifetimes. And you have a certain experience until you don't want it anymore. But what am I saying here? I'm saying you are having an experience. Where does the experience take place? Inside your mind. What gives you a certain experience? The conditions in your mind. Now, the vast majority of people on Earth, if they heard this, they would say, oh, that's completely wrong. It's the outer conditions that give me an experience. Right? That's because they haven't come to the fundamental realization that we need to come to on the spiritual path. That the outer conditions don't matter. The only thing that matters is what happens in our consciousness. Because the purpose of the whole outer conditions is just the reality simulator, to give us experiences, make us feel they're real. And as I've said, there are two stages of the reality simulator, the immersion and the awakening. When you're in immersion, you think there's a real world here, and it has influence on you, it has power over you. When you start to awaken, there comes a point where you realize nothing in the world has inherent power over you. It only has the power you give it. And how do you give it power? Through your own consciousness, the conditions in your subconscious mind. Like I've talked about, part of the ego is made up of all these individual selves. So, you are in a situation. You have a certain expectation that a bad thing shouldn't happen. Then that bad thing happens to you. And you feel, oh, I got to be upset. I got to feel bad. I've got to be angry. I've got to blame somebody. And there's always somebody out there. Right. Fine. You're allowed to have that experience. But there comes a point you've had enough of that experience. And the only way to get out of this experience is to take responsibility for yourself and say, is it really the outer conditions that created my inner experience? Or was it the conditions in my subconscious mind? And therefore, is it possible that without changing the outer conditions, I can still change my life experience? Think about that. What is it that most people believe on Earth? The only way to be happy is to have enough money, have the right partner, have this, have that, outside yourself. That's immersion. And it's fine if people are allowed to have that experience. I'm not saying it. But if you're a spiritual person, and if you want to get out of here by ascending, you have to overcome that illusion and realize everything that you ever experience takes place inside your mind, and it depends on the conditions in your mind. Now, take the situation. Something bad happens to you. You think you can only react by being angry. That's because you have a subconscious self, and it's based on the illusion that if this thing happens to you, you have to be angry. But you can step outside of that self and say, why should I react that way? You can let the self die, and then you are free to react it. You can choose your reaction instead of not choosing it. But you can even step further back and say, why do I have the expectation on a planet as chaotic as Earth that certain things shouldn't happen to me? That's because you have another subconscious self that's based on that expectation of what should and shouldn't happen to you. You can also step outside of that and say, well, as long as I have expectations of what should or shouldn't happen, I'm not really free to choose my life experience. So in other words, you can realize that most people think there's a direct cause-effect relationship between outer circumstances, your life experience. But you can break that and realize that the cause of your life experience is in your mind. And it's perfectly true there are many outer conditions on earth you don't have power to change. But you do have the power, or at least you can come to have the power of changing all the conditions in your own mind, in your own psyche, in your subconscious mind, by pulling these cells out of the subconscious and seeing them and dismissing them. This is the power you can have. So, what is the advantage that the ego gives you? It gives you a justification for not doing this, for not looking at yourself. And you can say that for most people this is fine. I mean, if you're still in the immersion phase of the simulator, people don't need to know this, they don't need to think about it. But if you're a spiritual person, and if you weren't spiritual, why would you be watching this? If you want to get beyond a certain point of the spiritual path, you have to come to that realization that your life experience is determined by the conditions in your subconscious mind. And you have the power to take command over this. This is what I mean when I say taking responsibility for yourself, for your saying, let me look within instead of looking without. And what the ego dramas, especially the epic dramas, do, they are pulling you away from doing this. They're doing everything they can to make you think you don't have to do this. Now, I, for example, and you can say they're the outer dramas that do it because you have to work for this cause, but it can have a spiritual version of it. I found my second spiritual movement, the Summit Lighthouse, which is based on the Ascended Master teachings, back in the early 1980s, and for several years I was completely focused on giving these decree sessions that we gave. I moved to Montana in the United States where the Summit Lighthouse had its headquarters, and I participated in a lot of these decree services. They had 3 services a week that were 4 hours long. Some services went even longer than 4 hours. And I was there and I was giving all these decrees, and I really felt this gave me a great sense of purpose. And I'm not saying it wasn't valid to be there and invoke spiritual light from the Ascended Masters. It is valid. But I was approaching it from an epic mindset, that I was doing this to save the world. And it gave my personal ego the perfect excuse for why I should always look outside myself. It was just, we are so busy, we have to give all these decrees to save the world for Saint Germain and defeat communism and prevent a nuclear war, that we just can't think about ourselves. We can't look at our own psychology. There was a point where I realized that the state of mind I had been in was basically the same state of mind that soldiers were in when they're at war, when they can't think of their normal lives. And they're certainly not going to look at their psychology and say, why do I feel bad today? Oh, maybe it's because I could be exposed to artillery fire any moment. But you know what I mean? They're always looking out, defending themselves. And I was in this fight or flight mode, basically, a stress mode. And then in the early 1990s, the masters started actually talking about resolving psychology. And I made a switch, and I decided to make that the focus of my life instead of always looking out. I was still doing decrees and participating in these sessions, but it was no longer an excuse for directing my attention out and not looking at myself. So this is why it's important to come to understand that the epic dramas, the ego dramas, they are doing something for us. They are giving us an excuse for not taking full responsibility for our state of mind, not taking command for our state of mind. And what it really does is it's making us cling to this outer sense of security that the ego has created. In my case, I didn't see myself as God's chosen people, but I saw myself as one of the most advanced spiritual students on earth because I had found an Ascended Master teaching and I had gone wholeheartedly into it and committed to it. So this gave my ego a sense of equilibrium, sense of security. I'm one of the right people. I'm doing the right thing. And it was, of course, a house built on sand. And if I had not been willing to admit that, if I had clung to that sense of outer security, I wouldn't have grown since the early 1990s. I would still be in the same state of consciousness. So, well, maybe I would have grown because I would have gotten some hard knocks, but that's another thing. But what I'm saying is that in order to really overcome these epic ego dramas, you have to look at the advantage that they give to offer to your personal ego is that you can continue looking out instead of looking in. And you don't have to take responsibility for changing your state of mind by taking command over your mind instead of trying to change outer conditions. In a sense, I was feeling that if we can change the world so there's peace on earth, then I will have the ultimate equilibrium. But this was, mind you, back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. It was while there was still the Cold War, and communism, the Soviet Union was still strong and seemed like it would be there forever. But just think back at the world today. I mean, 35 years later, is there peace and tranquility on the planet? No. So if I had had that attitude from the early 1990s that my peace of mind depends on outer conditions, would I have attained any kind of peace of mind in that time? Not likely, right? So the only way to get more peace of mind, which I have today compared to back then, was to switch and look within and say, what is it inside of me that takes away my peace of mind? Oh yeah, it's the ego that's hiding behind these epic dramas that I always have to solve problems out there instead of solving the problems in here by overcoming these separate selves. So anyway, without going on forever, I think this gives you a better foundation for evaluating the ego dramas. See if you still have remnants of it in yourself. See, it's important to realize here that you can very well be a spiritual student who has made a lot of progress on the path, but you still have a separate self that is based on one of these ego dramas. You're just not aware of it because it's not as strong or it's suppressed, so it's not really affecting you in your daily life. And I can see it in myself. You know, sometimes I can think back, you know, the masters gave some kind of teaching about a certain psychology, and at first I thought, well, but I don't really feel like I have that, because it wasn't something that was affecting me all the time. But then when I started looking deeper into it, I realized, well, yes, I have a self that is based on this ego drama. It's not that it's taking over my consciousness and running my life like it was, you know, when I was decreeing all the time and focusing on saving the world. This was all encompassing. It was eating up my life. But you can have a self that's in the background. You don't even notice it. But I'm just saying, in order to really make progress on the path and get beyond it, you have to see the self and dismiss it. And so, you know, there can be a certain resistance on the spiritual path to seeing these things. I can see it myself many years when I was on the spiritual path. I've talked about this before in several videos, but I was in this catch-22 where I wanted to seem like I was a good student of the Ascended Masters. And I thought as a good student you can't have ego. So therefore I didn't want to look at what ego I had left. And it was really a huge turning point for me when I realized how illogical that was. Because how was I going to fool the Ascended Masters? If I couldn't see my ego, does that mean the Masters couldn't see my ego? No, of course not. Does that mean I could ascend with that ego? No, of course not. So if I wanted to ascend, I had to overcome that element of ego. And how do you overcome it? Only by looking at it. So if I'm not willing to look at it, but I claim to be a good spiritual student, it's cognitive dissonance, right? So what I'm trying to say is, you may feel when you hear some of these ego dramas, oh, it doesn't apply to me. But if you look a little bit closer, you might see yes, it really doesn't apply to you in the sense that it's running your life. But there can still be this separate self that's lying dormant down there, and that it's not going to be a huge task to overcome it. It may be that you just need to look at it and recognize it. And the moment you see it, the conscious you separates itself from it, and you can just say, I'm not going to try and solve the problem that this self is projecting. I'm just going to let the self die. And this can be a breakthrough. And the more breakthroughs you have, the more you are free of these ego dramas, the more your sense of security, equilibrium will be based on the rock of Christ instead of your shifting sense of the ego.